Hello, how are we doing? We all awake? We still surviving? My name's Matt, Dr. Matt Lodder. I am an art historian. Whenever I say that, it always sounds like a confessional, right? Like, I admit to being an art historian. I'm not, especially at industry conferences like this. I was just at APP in Vegas, and here it's really interesting to be amongst professionals, piercers, tattooers, body modification artists, because I'm not any of those things. I am a historian. I teach art history and interdisciplinary studies at the University of Essex in just outside of London in the UK. But I'm not one of those academics who was bored of doing something else and came to, as a sort of side project, came to tattooing. I've been around the tattoo industry and the piercing industry and the piercing scene and the body mod scene since the late 90s or mid 90s, really. I'm very honored that people that I've known for 20 years are here. People like Sean Porter and Hover, Ryochi, Mieda. And so, and I talk about this stuff all the time to a lot of different audiences, but audiences of people that know the stuff is kind of my favorite group of people. You are my favorite group of people. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Painted People, which came out in hardback in 2021 and in paperback in late 2023. And that is, as I sort of describe it, not so much a history of tattooing, but a history through tattooing, a series of 21 sort of vignettes, 20 actually, plus a sort of side story of tattooed people through history. And I'm really proud of that book. It's, I hope, interesting. You can still get hold of it in all good bookshops, and there's an audiobook version as well for people that don't enjoy the written word but want to listen to it. You can get that on Audible and Spotify and stuff. But I got the only bad Amazon review this book's had was from someone who said it didn't have enough pictures. Right? Which is a fair comment. I wish it had more pictures too, that book, but making picture books is, especially picture books for mass audiences, is expensive and difficult and complicated. And so for my first book, the publisher, who are a big publisher, HarperCollins, just weren't going to kind of put the financial risk into publishing a big, beautiful coffee table book. But my this talk today is about my second book, which is coming out in November, which is finished, and it's kind of literally at the printers at the moment, out in Dubai. And it's called Tattoos, The Untold History of a Modern Art. And I'm going to sort of be presenting a very sort of whistle-stop tour of that in this session. And it has got lots of pictures, thanks to the help of people like Manfred Kors and Paul King, and Stefan, who runs BMX, and some other amazing people who've been very kind to me and let me use photographs in the book. So this is coming out just in time for Christmas. Get it on your Christmas lists, guys, in November on Yale University Press. And it's because it's with a big trade press. It's not going to be one of those tattoo books that costs, $100 or 200 euros or something. It's going to be like a 25 quid, nice hardback book. So please buy copies. Doesn't actually benefit me financially because all the money goes to the publisher. But the point of the book is to get this information out there, and I'm really happy to, as I said, be sharing it today. It was kind of difficult, as we'll go through, to try and tell a 300-year story about the history of the tattoo industry in essentially a kind of about 40,000 words. So it's a very kind of like quick overview. There's lots of depth that is occluded and missing from the book, but it does, I hope, give a very connective story from the earliest moments and even the earliest moments when we have what resembles professional tattooing, and I'll come and explain to that in more detail, in the early 18th century, right the way through to more or less the present. Although, as I always point out to people, I find it very hard to think about things that have happened since I became a professional historian in the early 2000s as history, right? I find it very hard to conceptualize anything that happened after about 2005 as being history at all. We as historians need time anyway to kind of make sense of things, but I just emotionally can't deal with the fact that I'm getting old, right? But also after 2005 or so, the tattoo universe gets very complicated, and so I deal with that very quickly at the end of the book. But we really get up to about 2000. And it's chronologically oriented. This is like the table of contents. Some chapters cover longer periods than others. There is one whole chapter, for reasons I'll tell you in a minute, about one single year, in 1977. Some of the chapters cover centuries. Some of them cover decades. I said one chapter in the middle covers a single year because it's so pivotal to the story. So what I want to do, as I said, with the time we've got, is just kind of go through, and then we'll have time. I time this talk for about an hour or so, and then we can have conversations afterwards. I'm also doing another talk tomorrow about, which I'm going to touch upon briefly today, about some of the interactions between the modern Western tattoo industry and Japan. So I'll mention that briefly, but I'm going to be talking more about that tomorrow. And yeah, to also be really clear, if people haven't seen my work before, when I talk about tattooing, I'm talking exclusively, basically, about the tattooing in the global north, in the West, in America, Europe, Australia. I don't talk about indigenous tattoo practices. I don't talk about ethnographic stuff, except when those practices are influential on or intersect with the modern professional industry. Let's just sort of go through, right? Like, writing books like this has been, it's surprisingly the last book of this kind, a sort of attempt to tell the story of the Western tattoo industry, of how we got to where we are now. The last version of this came out in 1954, a book called Pierced Hearts and True Love, written by a guy called Hans Ebertson. And before that, there'd maybe been like one other attempt, a book written in the 1930s by a Russian-born, American-based academic called Albert Parry, called Tattoos, Secrets of a Strange Art. But there's not really been an attempt to tell this story in the way I'm doing it since the 1950s. There have been some attempts since, and these are two of the people that tried to do books like this one, which for various reasons didn't work out. This could be a whole lecture on its own, but like this guy on the left is a guy called Dr. John Leames. Leames was actually a medical psychiatrist, and in the 1970s, he got tattooed extensively by Ed Hardy. If any of you have seen a book called The Tattooists by Albert Morse with a big squid on the cover tattoo, that's Leames. To cut a long story short, Leames basically was one of these people that, he was getting tattooed and hanging around tattoo people in the late 60s, early 70s, and was like, you know what tattooing needs more of? Me. So he began talking to everybody, from Sailor Jerry to Ed Hardy to people in Europe, people in Japan, to try and kind of collect all the information he could about tattooing, historically, anthropologically. He was even figuring out or asking how much tattooists charged, a very sort of taboo topic that wasn't discussed openly. He was asking about how to build machines and what was in pigments, all these kind of trade secrets. And he put together the basis of what was going to be a 1,300-page tattoo encyclopedia of like essentially the collective knowledge on the Western tattoo industry. And as he was basically about to publish it, the people he'd been talking to got wind of it and were like, oh, we thought we were just talking to you and you're putting this in a book? Like, fuck you. And they the industry denounced him. Cliff Raven and Arnold Rubin, who was an academic big sort of tattoo researcher based in UCLA, did an open letter saying don't listen to this guy, don't trust him, and the project never happened. The book never came out. That's a short version of a much longer story, but that's the top line. Had that book come out in the 1970s, it would have made my career a lot easier, frankly, but nevertheless. And then even prior to that, there was another attempt, a book that was going to be called The Primitive Urge, written by these two men, Fakir Mushafar and Davy Jones. Davy Jones was a tattooer who worked with Lyle Tuttle in San Francisco, and Fakir Mushafar, about whom we could also do a whole separate lecture, was the most kind of influential founding figure of what becomes known as the modern primitive movement. And even in the 1960s, Davy Jones as the tattooer and Fakir as the kind of ideological and spiritual kind of driver of this stuff wanted to publish a book about what we now call tribal tattooing, black work stuff in the mid-60s. And they sent photos to and pitches for the book, which is also going to have a few little short essays, but largely photographic, to publishers all across America and the world. And everyone was like, no one wants to buy books about tattoos. And I sort of wonder, given how, and I'll talk about this as we go through, given how influential Modern Primitives was when it came out in 1989, given how influential even Don Ed Hardy's New Tribalism, Tattoo Time, that came out in 1982 was, how the world of tattooing and the world in general would have looked differently had this book come out in 20 years earlier, right? 15, 20 years earlier. Like, what would have happened if the world had got Fakir's black work in the mid-60s rather than in the late 80s? I think that's an interesting kind of counterfactual that I encourage you to muse on. But anyway, so these books have long been a difficult sell, and they've been difficult to write because essentially one of the issues is that, people like Leames, who aren't tattooers and who come at it from outside, try and write books, and people who are tattooers who come from inside try and write books, and it's difficult to make those two things meet together. And what I've been doing in my whole career is trying to bridge that gap in a way that is respectful. I'm never trying to, do what Leames did and tell people how to do tattoos, and I try and not betray confidences, and I'm very grateful that people trust me with information and images. But at the same time, I'm able to take the work of the tattooers and insiders that I know who have so much information but don't have the ability to write it down or to contextualize it perhaps, and try and bridge the two together. So I find myself, after sort of 25 years of doing this, in a very privileged position of being able to bridge these stories together. So, okay, that's the kind of overview. And when I was putting the book together, I was struggling with how to, what the introduction was going to be. You always write the introduction to books last, because it's when you know what they're about. And I went and visited the Body Piercing Archive in February, and Paul showed me the unpublished manuscripts of both of these books, and I was like, oh, this makes sense, right? This is so that that's what the first sort of intro of the book is about. But the proper history, here we go. So as we'll come to, the real kind of birth of what we now think of as professional tattooing, by which I mean walking into a tattoo shop, paying someone you never met before money to get a tattoo, doesn't begin until the middle of the 19th century. But of course, there is a kind of prehistory to this. It's a whole separate lecture, and I go into this in detail in Painted People. For a long time, people thought that there was no tattooing in Europe at all, because it had been discovered in New Zealand, Tahiti, Samoa in the middle of the 18th century. However, there is a much longer history that goes back at least 150, and perhaps even now with new research that has been done by some colleagues of mine, some friends of mine in France, to push the kind of professional tattooing in Europe, that going in and paying money to someone you've never met before and getting tattooed, back to the 16th century, back to the middle of the 1500s. So the most obvious example of this, the most kind of well-known and well-documented, is the tattoos on pilgrims from Europe, French, German, Dutch, to places like Jerusalem and Bethlehem, beginning in the late 1500s, and certainly really kicking off properly in the early 1600s, in the 17th century. So even in these moments after this Pacific encounter, right, when tattooing was discovered in the 1760s in the Pacific, people who at the time were around understood that this was something that had been well known and well documented for a couple of centuries beforehand. It wasn't called tattooing. The word tattoo, in its modern meaning of putting ink in the skin, does come from that. We get it into English from Tahitian, although the word tattoo did exist in English before, meaning a drum beat. But the practice was called things like pricking, marking, staining, pouncing, and in English, and different words in French and German. And the most well documented or the most understood was the stories of these pilgrims who would go from Europe to places in the Holy Land, and while they were there, just like if you go on holiday to Magaluf and get your bum tattooed to show you've been on holiday, getting tattoos to mark your pilgrimage. And they're basically tourist tattoos of a kind, but they also serve a kind of spiritual function as well to encode the fact that you've been on a pilgrimage. And this man, we don't know who he is, but he's tattooed sometime in the early 17th century. And there's only actually 6 images of, there's lots of descriptions in books, but only 6 surviving contemporaneous drawings or paintings of pilgrims from this period. And this is one of the best that we've found. And you can see there a date on his wrist, 1660 something. This is what's called the Jerusalem cross. One central cross with 4 crosses around it, which was like the kind of symbol of Jerusalem, like Christianity spreading out from the Holy Land. The mark of King James, Jacobus Rex, the Protestant king of England and Scotland. And then this is actually the floor plan of the Holy Sepulchre, the floor plan of the main pilgrimage site in Jerusalem. And these tattoos in Jerusalem were done largely by Coptic Christians from Egypt. And he's also been to Nazareth on a tour. And these are amazing. So this is already 100 years earlier than Captain Cook. And the practice is, still goes on today. There's still a tattoo family, the Razouks in Jerusalem, tattooing in the same way, using these woodblock stamps, carving designs into olive wood, often on both sides, stamping it on the skin like a potato print, and then tattooing over by hand. And for a long time, it was really thought that we did, and literally until this year, with this new research by Luc Renaud in France, we really did think that this practice was syncretized from Bedouin tattooing in North Africa. So Coptic Christians who've been around indigenous tattoo practices amongst Bedouin learn the practice, the technology of tattooing, and come to work in this Christian pilgrimage site, right? But it now actually turns out that, so the earliest evidence we have of pilgrimage tattooing beginning is like the 1570s. It now turns out that even as early as the 1540s, so a few decades before we have any evidence of tattooing in the Holy Land, there was tattooing happening in bathhouses in Italy. So there's a couple of very rare sources in Latin that Luc Renaud found. I found them independently, sent them to him because I knew he'd be interested. And he was like, "Oh, fuck, you found them. I'm going to have to publish this work now because you've cracked the code." But basically, the as yet earliest evidence we found of what even resembles professional tattooing is in the 1550s in the context of medical bloodletting of a kind, cupping or lancet scarification to bloodlet. When they were healed by these descriptions, and we have very scant descriptions, but when they were healed with a kind of mineral mud containing cinnabar, a mineral ore, which is red. And you can imagine that if you're cupping or creating wounds in the skin or using a lancet to bloodlet, that mineral mud will heal in the skin and it will leave marks. And the descriptions that we have are like, oh, and so then we realized we could use that. And we started making religious marks. So it may even be the case that these pilgrim tattoos began in Europe and then were taken to the Holy Land. We also have some early examples. I included this because I think this woman, who's from 1503, looks like she should be at this conference. Right? All of you cool kids with your face tattoos and shit, you're 600 years out of date, 500 years out of date. So this isn't tattooing. This is actually what are called Wunderzeichen, miraculous marks, stigmata. This is a woman called Margarete Bruck, and the story is that, miraculously revealed on her body were signs of the Passion of Christ. So you may have heard, if you've heard of this before, it's normally through the context of stigmata, marks on the hands, which are said to resemble the nail marks of Jesus being crucified. But this woman is fucking hardcore. She's got the ladder that took Christ up to the cross. She's got like the pierced heart of Christ. She's got the whip with which he was flogged on the cross. She's got the crown of thorns. And she's also got those stigmatic marks on her hands. So these are miraculous marks. Often the main working theory for these is that basically they're pareidolia. So people get skin conditions and people say, oh, this resembles this, and, like looking at the kind of ink blots and seeing what you want to see. But I think they're really interesting in terms of kind of thinking about body marking even in this pre-tattoo period. And what I also find interesting, here she is again in a color image. What I also find interesting is that these drawings are post 1492, of course, when Europeans encountered native North Americans with tattoo marks. And there is some kind of interesting correspondence that perhaps, because tattoos on people in what is modern day Florida or in modern day Baffin Island in Canada, Labrador, in Puerto Rico, the Taino, there's a potential feeling here that the technology and the understanding of how to make these marks came from native North America and was then used to sort of fake miraculous marks. Hers are depicted as red, and these aren't documentary images, so it's, we can't take them as drawn from life or anything. But there's some other matching images to this where some of the marks are green rather than red, which seems to suggest perhaps tattooing of a kind. Anyway, I don't know, I just think it's interesting, and I said want to include that because I think, we stan a 500-year-old queen, right? So, so then we have to sort of think about, okay, so that's all like precursor. And it's not in Europe. When do we get tattooing documented happening in Europe? So there's a few examples. The earliest one that we found, as I said, is in 1719, which is the descriptions of two men in London who were arrested for housebreaking, for burglary. And in their arrest, it is noted that they have on them the Jerusalem mark, that cross that I showed you earlier on. And one of them says to the magistrate, I make it my business to make the Jerusalem mark. So this guy basically says in 1719, it's my job to do pilgrimage tattoos on people who aren't going on pilgrimages. Like, that is kind of amazing. It's not quite professional tattooing. You're not walking into a tattoo shop, and we don't know anything about it other than that. But that is kind of good, clear evidence of 100 years, 150 years before Cook, that there's someone in England doing tattooing. This is actually from Italy in the 1740s, again, before Cook. And the description of this is in Venice, and the description on this, it's in a book of professions of Venice. And the tattooer is interviewed, and he basically says, we learned this from the Greeks. And the Greeks had, we know from ancient sources, tattooing being done on prisoners, for example, right? So there's an ancient classic world story to this too. But this is modern kind of tattooing of that pilgrimage kind happening in Italy, in Venice. And what I love is he's also got those wood blocks. Right, so these are those same wood blocks that were being used in Jerusalem. And it's not a great high-res scan. There's a better version in the book, actually, of a high resolution. But some of these images, they're very classic tattoo designs. They're pierced hearts. They're like pin-up girls of a kind, 1740-ish, 1735, something like that. The standard story of if you believe this kind of Cook myth, was that sailors went to Tahiti, Samoa, saw what the natives were doing and then copied it. And that's why tattooing becomes possible in Europe in the 19th century. But actually, the exact opposite is true. The effect of tattooing in the Pacific on tattooing in Europe is basically nothing. The tattoos we have sparsely documented before the 1760s, and those we have documented afterwards are completely the same. These sailor motifs, these religious motifs, very, very few people are coming back to England with moko, black work, Samoan tattooing. There are exceptions. This is one of them. A guy called William Torrey People who get called transculturites, men who, for one reason or another, find themselves in living amongst native peoples in the Pacific, or sometimes in native North America, and getting tattooed to sort of fit in. Then they come back to England, or Germany, or Belgium in one case, actually, and claim that they've been captured against their will and tattooed by savages as a way to kind of make money on the touring fairs. But very few of those stories none of the stories really stand up to any scrutiny. So other than these few examples of people getting, so Tory described being held in New Zealand in the middle of the 19th century. There's not really any evidence of this kind of stuff in the general sort of sailor records from the 19th century. What we do have instead is, as I said, this continuity of designs that go back, even some potentially to these stigmatic marks, but certainly back to the things that I was showing you in that Venetian example, with crosses and ships and stuff. This is a guy called Miles Comfrey, who ran away from he was about to be transported for theft, and they sort of basically put a wanted picture of him in the newspapers. Very rare to have pictures of him, pictures of tattooed people. He's got a mermaid on his arm here. But what I like about him is he's got a cartoon on his chest of a robbery, very contemporary. I'm really interested in this relationship between popular culture, print culture, and tattooing. And lots of people, now people are coming to your guys' studios and printing stuff off of Instagram or Pinterest. Like, this is just probably a cartoon cut out of a magazine in the 19th century. But all of that I sort of call pre-professional, because although undoubtedly people are getting money and there's, most of it's in intimate settings, it's between people who know each other and no one's making it their main job. And that really begins, the ability to make tattooing your job in England, in Europe, begins after the opening of Japan in the middle of the 19th century. So the first professional tattooer of the kind that I'm discussing, who has a shop with an address that's in the street directory, who is advertised as a tattooist, as a job, is a guy called Martin Hildebrandt. And Hildebrandt's shop first appears in the New York Street Directory in 1859. There's no surviving pictures that we found of Hildebrandt, but this is one of his rivals, a guy called Edwin Thomas, from around the same period. And what I love is really almost since the birth of this professional industry. So Hildebrandt started working in the 1850s. He gave tattooing up for a bit because of the American Civil War, and then really took it up again in the mid to late 1870s. And right away, right from the beginning, everyone's like, this tattoo thing's a hot new trend. You'll never guess who's getting tattooed now. We used to think it was only sailors who got tattooed, and now everyone's getting tattooed, right? Over 140 years, people have been saying that shit, right? This metropolis, said the New York Times in 1882, is addicted to short-lived hobbies. They were born about every month, and about this time they become possibly introduced, are displaced for a later attraction. The latest fashionable folly I discovered the day before yesterday is tattooing, right? Don't worry, kids, it'll be uncool any minute now. And so Hildebrandt is an interesting guy. He claimed, he was a sailor. He was tattooing whilst a sailor, but he very quickly became famous as this professional, not just for his own work, but also because this is also the birth of the kind of what's called the dime theatre era, with the kind of performing tattooed men. And one of the most famous first performing tattooed men in America is a guy called Harry de Courcy, who'd actually been a jeweler from Brooklyn, but he was very extensively tattooed by Hildebrandt and one of Hildebrandt's apprentices. And Hildebrandt's work, became sort of very quickly world famous for being extensive and impressive. So sometimes there are photos of this guy. If you Google image search Hildebrandt, this photo comes up. People think it is Hildebrandt. It's not. This is one of his customers, Harry de Courcy. And so, Japan is really important in this story, as I said. So Japan had been closed off to the West for about 250 years. The Americans showed up in the 1850s and said, if you don't trade with us, we're going to fucking colonize you. They sent a white flag and fly this or we're invading. The Japanese flew the white flag, and opened up Japan to the West. And actually, one of the things, so Japan was this incredible, because it had been this isolated community for so long, it had its very own, very unique culture, particularly visual arts. And the late 19th century becomes this moment of enormous Japonism, enormous influence from Japanese art in European painting and decorative art. And everything Japanese becomes very fashionable. And one of the things that Europeans are very interested by is tattooing, because what we now call modern Japanese tattooing was only about 100 years old. In the 1850s, it seems to begin in its modern form in the 1700s. It's not very old at the time, but it is very extensive compared to what was happening in Europe. And it became super interesting. This is an image of a kind that's called a Yokohama air, a sort of image of Yokohama, which was one of the ports that Europeans came to. And it shows these Europeans, who are very distinctively depicted in Japanese woodblock printing of the time, like looking at how weird Japan is, and then the Japanese people looking at how weird they are back. It's like, who are these fucking weirdos? Right, including this tattooed, like probably palanquin. And anyway, I'll talk more about that moment tomorrow, but essentially, in order to avoid getting colonized, the Japanese government decided very quickly that they had to appear as European as possible, as quickly as possible. And one of the ways they did that was by banning tattooing, or trying to ban tattooing. It's a long story. There had been some social attempts to ban it beforehand, but one of the things the Japanese did not want to look like to Europeans was different to them. And so tattooing was banned, except for on foreigners. So actually a lot of tattooers that were working in Japan ended up having to market themselves to foreigners in order to work. Many left Japan, went to Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, Malta, and then Paris, London, New York, and San Francisco, bringing Japanese designs with them. And something similar happens, as again I'll talk about tomorrow, in the other direction. But it's this stuff that makes a tattoo industry, one of the two things that makes having a tattoo industry possible. Because all of a sudden people want to get this kind of stuff, but they don't want to go through the hassle of going to Japan. And I think it's no coincidence that Hildebrandt's first public shop happens immediately in the aftermath of the opening of Japan to the West. Hildebrandt claimed, although we haven't been able to find the evidence of the truth of this, but he claimed to have been on the voyage, the second voyage that first opened Japan to the West with Captain Perry. So this linked with Japan was very important. The other thing that happened, and I realize I'm probably going quite slow, but the other thing that happened really importantly was this case. Read more about it in my book, but it's the case of the Tichborne claimant. Essentially, this guy on the left, Roger Tichborne, he was an aristocrat, French-born, English domiciled aristocrat whose ship sunk at sea in the 1850s. And his mother never gave up hope that he was going to be found alive. His younger brother was a kind of arsehole, and she was like, I don't want the younger brother to inherit the family fortune. And so for about 20 years, she was like putting adverts all around the world. Was anyone rescued from this shipwreck off the coast of Brazil? And it turns out miraculously, he was alive. He was working as a butcher in rural Australia. Can you believe that? 20 years later, he was a bit fatter by this point. He'd forgotten how to speak French, which, is understandable. He'd been in a shipwreck. He didn't really recognize the family home, but, he'd been away for a long time. Anyway, he came back to England in order to claim the fortune, to claim the family fortune. And the surviving cousins were like, we don't think that's actually our cousin, dude. And so there was this amazing trial beginning in 1871, and it was serialized in the Times of London every single day. There were weekly reports about the trial in the New York Times in America. And the whole trial, which captivated the nation, came to a grinding halt when in the dock, the lawyer for the surviving Tichborne heirs said to the guy who gets known as the claimant, says to the claimant, can you roll your sleeves up? And he says, why? And he says, because we've got evidence. So Roger Tichborne, the aristocrat, had tattoos on his arm. He had a faith, hope, and charity design, an anchor, a cross, and a heart. And if you haven't got that tattoo, you can't be the same man. So of course, he rolls his sleeve up and there's no mark. And the jury that day sent a letter to the judge and said, we've seen all we need to see. This is over. And so it turns out, right, as I said, this guy's a butcher's son from Wapping called Tom Castro, trying his luck. But the idea that like rich aristocrats like Tichborne had tattoos, he'd had it done in the 1850s at boarding school. The idea that rich aristocrats had tattoos and butchers' sons did not have tattoos was like, oh my God, what are rich people up to? Rich people have tattoos. Maybe, so this doesn't happen to our families, we should all get tattooed, right? Questions were asked in the House of Lords about that. And so all of a sudden, this idea that like it was a done thing, if you were a rich scion to tattoo, was like became authenticated in the mid 1870s. And those are the two things, the opening of Japan and the Tichborne case, which make tattooing a viable business that rich people want to do. And in fact, in the aftermath of the case, literally a couple of days after, there were adverts by people in the newspapers saying, hey, if you want to get a tattoo mark like the Tichborne guy, you can come to my house. And again, it's not quite professional tattooing because these people have other jobs. It's in the evening. But again, they're advertising professional tattoo services in the 1870s. This woman, who we don't know her name, a Polish woman who lived in Philadelphia in the 1870s, around the same time. In the aftermath of that Tichborne trial, this American journalist for the National Police Gazette basically says, I want to know if this is happening in America. And he hears talk of a woman in Philadelphia doing marks like the Tichborne marks in Philadelphia. And so he tracks down this woman and finds her and her assistant tattooing in a private home in Philadelphia on this like very glamorous demi-monde. So again, like one of the first like professional tattooers that we know about in the Western world. We don't know her name, but she's a woman tattooing like hot babes, you know, in the 1870s. Cool. The last thing, and it's sort of connected to both of the previous things, is the tattooing of King George V, or the future King George V, and his brother Albert Victor. They went to Jerusalem and Japan in 1881. And while they were there, they were both tattooed in Yokohama. Initially, the story came back that they'd had facial tattoos done on the end of their noses. And again, can you imagine how different British history would have been if our King of England had a fucking anchor on his face? That turned out that was actually not true. The story was that they had some dirt on their noses and someone had misreported it. But shortly after, when they went to Japan, they were tattooed. And this is claimed to be, although probably isn't actually, the dragon that was tattooed on the arm of King George V. And this was so famous as a moment in his life that it became like there was a sort of souvenir pullout when he got married to Mary of Teck. And so everyone knew that like the king has got a tattoo. And so everyone wants to copy the royal family. They're like the celebrity culture of the time. So all of those things make having a tattoo possible and spending money on a tattoo possible. And so people who'd been tattooing in the army, in the navy, or independently, all of a sudden found themselves able to charge money. And this is where we end up with a tattoo industry of the modern kind for the first time. In London, the main proponent of this is a guy called Sutherland MacDonald, who, again, I could do a whole talk about, but basically he was in the army. He'd been raised, his parents owned a Turkish bath in Guildford. He got a job after he came out of the Anglo-Zulu War running the bathhouse in the middle of London, in Jermyn Street, like the posh West End of London. Rich clients on a street with art galleries and tailors' shops. He was running the bathhouse for a while, but word got around that he was a phenomenal tattooer. And he initially began tattooing part-time and then quickly built a purpose-built tattoo studio on the roof of the building, and it became his full-time profession. He's the guy that claimed to have invented the word tattooist. And he didn't really, but he claimed that tattooer made him sound too much like a plumber or a builder. He's like, I'm an artist, goddammit. And someone asked him in 1885, like, do you think tattooing's like too trendy now? And he was like, yeah, I think so. I liked it when it was underground, you know? 135 years ago or something. He's very inspired by Japanese design that's coming into Britain by this period. copying things from books of things like likes of Hokusai, and also paintings by European salon painters. This is actually based on a painting by a Spanish salon painter called Luis Valero, but done in this Japanese style of like negative space. Kind of super cool. Yeah, and I collect these headlines. You know, they're not just for sailors anymore, headlines. Tattooing is on the increase. It's not confined to seamen only, says the New York Times in 1908. McDonald, I did a lot of work on McDonald. I uncovered a lot of these pictures. They're now all over Instagram. These often get labeled as like, you know, tattooed criminal, tattooed sailor. This guy is a lawyer who went on to become the county bursar of Bedfordshire, like massively rich, because to get this kind of work is fucking expensive. Long sessions, like Japanese work with designs taken from Hokusai on his arm, these incredible dragons. All the work is signed. McDonald always had SM, his signature, and he signed his work. And to get through long sessions, he used to mix cocaine in with the tattoo ink. Don't do that at home, kids. And you can see, you know, how he's advertising himself under patronage of the highest royal personages. And he claimed at least to have tattooed like various kings and queens, many of which he probably didn't tattoo. Many of those were known to have been tattooed in Japan, but it's a good lie, right? Like, oh, you read in the paper that like King Alexandra or Queen Alexandra or Tsar Nicholas II were tattooed in Japan. Like, I tattooed them back when they came home, right? It's a good lie, because then you get the middle class people, the upper middle class people like this guy, members of the House of Lords, you know, rich aristocratic young men and women who come to you because they want to be like the social class above them. In America, the tattoo industry is a bit more low rent, although even people like Samuel O'Reilly here, the man who sort of invented the modern tattoo machine, he claimed again to have had royal customers, but New York was a bit rougher, you know, than London was in the period. A lot of O'Reilly's work, he worked in Chatham Square in the Bowery in New York, was on sailors, and, you know, rough types. It was a rougher part of town, but even O'Reilly claimed, you know, higher end customers. And O'Reilly, for a while, had working with him a Japanese artist called Hori Toyo. Cool. So I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow. The effect is also bilateral. So Japanese tattooers, as I said, who were banned from tattooing Japanese people, had to then make a living tattooing Westerners, and so their style adapted. This tattoo was done, or this flash was done in about 1907 by a tattooer from Japan called Ikesaki, who was working in Nagasaki. And as I'll talk more about tomorrow, these images show a kind of hybridization in the other direction. And they're amazing, beautiful images of cross-cultural hybridization as these styles meld in both directions. And again, I'll talk more about that in more detail tomorrow. And this is actually a layout from the book. So we've got like, you know, if you like old school Japanese tattooing, you need to get monkeys riding bikes. Like this is the real OG shit, right? The man who claimed to tattoo King George was a man called Hori Chiyo. In Yokohama. Japanese historians dispute whether he actually was the person that did those tattoos, and contemporaneous Japanese sources say that he wasn't very good. But he certainly made his name as the most famous tattooer in the world. And he was tattooing everything from these kind of battle royale pieces, these incredible compositions, to things like this, which is a monogram. You know, the kind of like, you know, the kind of things that many of you tattooers in the room might be doing, like names on people's arms. Like this is the 19th century equivalent of that. Like with everything, the rich people, you know, inspire then the royal family inspire the upper middle class inspire the lower middle class, and the middle class inspire the working class. This is what happens with everything. Happens with taste of all kinds. Happens with clothing. Happens with children's names, even, right? Things that began as like, you know, posh people's names, aristocratic names, are now names, you know, that are considered lower working class. And so it was with tattooing. The upper classes got disinterested, but it meant that more and more people down the social spectrum are getting tattooed. The style changes a bit too. Tattooing starts getting smaller, and we start getting more of the kind of stampy stuff because it's, again, you don't want to get your dad's tattoos, right? So the 19th century, people are getting large-scale work, largely at the upper end of the professional industry at least. By the time we get into the 20th century, it's much smaller. And of course, like, wartime is a big driver of this. People who are going away to war, you can't take stuff with you a lot of the time that's valuable, you might lose it. So tattooing is a good way to kind of take memories and love with you that you can't lose. And there's obviously beautiful symbolism of having love tokens, names of loved ones, images of home. I often say that in this period, like, the tattooing is basically like things you love, things you hate, and things you want to fuck. And maybe the third thing is the first two things as well, right? Like, these very basic things that people kind of relate to, whether it's religious iconography, whether it's patriotic imagery, or whether it's images of love or eroticism, work well as tattooing visually. We don't get what we call flash really until the sort of 1920s with mass production, but there are precursors. This is work by a American guy working in England called Albert Gordon, who did this beautiful hand-painted flash on card in the probably 1914 to 18 period. And this is actually from Germany, a guy called Karl Rodemich, who was a porcelain painter before he became a tattooer in the 1920s and 30s, like this incredible Japonesque but European work. The other thing that happens at this time, and again, I think people often imagine that this is something modern, is that tattooers do permanent makeup, and they also have private studios. They're not just working in the rough parts of town on the sailors. They have like nice private studios to tattoo classier clients, including often women who want permanent makeup. So this is a business card by George Burchett, who was one of the most important tattooers in the world in this period, advertising his private studio on Bond Street, a very kind of fancy part still of London, with permanent complexion tinting, right? He would tattoo sailors in a shop on Waterloo Road near the train station, and then he'd tattoo high-end women round the corner in this much posh salon. This I love. This is also by Gordon, one of the most incredible pieces of tattoo art ever discovered, in my opinion. It is a banner by Albert Gordon from around this period that is on canvas and allowed the tattooer to turn up when a ship came in or at a traveling show and like roll it out and pick your designs. And again, I think if you imagine like tattooing in this period to be quite rough and quite kind of uncultured, and we don't have tattoo art until like 5 minutes ago. If you look at the way that Gordon is producing flash and painting with this incredible, stylistically rich oil paint technique, I think hopefully some of your sense of these histories will change. And you can see, again, I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but you can see this bilateral relationship between Japanese and European design in this period. So yeah, we first get professional flash in the 20s, included work like this by Joseph Hartley. Although Joseph Hartley sold these uncolored, you could color them in, and you can see how like there are these lines here. The lines are because he sold the sheets, but he realized that lots of his customers were enlisted sailors, so you could cut these out and stick them in your sketchbook and take them with you and tattoo your pals during the war. And we have in Malta, there's a really beautiful sketchbook that was discovered on a British ship in 1911 with several of these designs pasted into them. And Burchett, anyone here using Procreate? Like, this is the Edwardian equivalent of that, like drawing in pen on photographs to test out what you're going to do compositionally. Okay. World War II is another important moment. Again, styles are changing a bit, but again, you can see like, oh look, women are getting tattooed now again. Turns out 1945. This is a guy called Charlie Bell from Chatham in Kent. But even in this period, there are like women tattooing. In fact, there are more women tattooing during the war than ever before because, of course, a lot of the men are away fighting. So this is the daughter of a tattooist called Joyce Derrick from Bristol. She's 16 years old here, tattooing in her father's shop in about 1943. And women are really left out part of this story often because it's often not their name that was above the door of the shop or in the street directories. Sometimes it was, but mostly the women that were working were daughters or wives of the male tattooer. And like, if it was really busy, the man would do the outline and the woman would do the shading or colouring in. Sometimes they were just down the pub, or wanted a day off. And so their wives and daughters would take up the work for them. And yeah, this is the daughter of a tattooer called H.G. Derrick from Bristol. The other thing that's happening importantly during this period is that styles are changing. So most of that 19th century stuff is based on 19th century print sources, which are very fine line because that's what 19th century print technology looks like. Engravings, right? Very fine line and etchings. In World War II, we start getting comic books, big fat line comic books being the things that young men and young women are reading and wanting to put on their bodies. And if you think about it, right, comic books have fat black lines because of a problem called misregistration. When you're printing a 4-color comic book, you publish each color separately. And sometimes the plates are slightly out of line with each other. And so the way to kind of mask that so you aren't putting your colored plates over the lines is to have big, thick line work. So the reason comic books have fat lines is a visual clarity, but it's also a mechanical necessity in early cheap comic book printing. And that means that when you are a tattooer, this is the work of Cap Coleman from Norfolk, Virginia. When you're someone like Cap Coleman who's tattooing a lot of sailors who come to you with references from comic books, you're copying the fat line style. So you're getting you're getting Popeye here from the 1930s and 40s, or these. And this sheet was actually, again, when we think about tattooing as art, which again people think happened 5 minutes ago, these are actually exhibited in the Mariners Museum in a specific tattoo history exhibition featuring Coleman's work in 1933. There's an interesting also persistence of images through design. So Coleman produced these flash designs in the 1930s, but then through the apprenticeship system and through the sharing of images, Paul Rogers and Huck Spalding, Paul Rogers, who became the most important tattoo supplier in the Western world for a long time, he used to go into, he first used to get people coming out of Coleman's shop and ask them if he could draw their tattoos. And then he made friends with Coleman and would go in and copy the work. And these flash designs that were done in 1937 were sold right the way through the 1970s as back piece flash by the Spalding and Rogers company. Okay. The other thing I want to mention is tattoo removal. People have been, for example, when the royal princes came back from Japan, in the 1880s, the thought was people were sending in recipes for tattoo removal, all kinds of things. People said use milk. Some people said there was no way to remove it. The first guy really to figure out properly how to remove tattoos was Christian Wahrlich in Hamburg, and he created a kind of special solvent mixture because tattooing in Germany during the Nazi period became very, very taboo and people wanted their tattoos removed. So he developed a technique where he could tattoo over with this special pigment, special mix of stuff. He'd wrap it up for a couple of days and then you could go back to him a few days later and he could remove it in one piece. Right? You didn't know with a fucking massive scar, but it would preserve the colors and preserve the skin. And there are collections in the museum in Hamburg and in some private hands of some of Wahrlich's skin removal techniques. And this technique was thought lost. He never told anyone it, but Ole Wittmann, a friend of ours from Germany, rediscovered the recipe and they tried it out on some pigskin and it worked very well. Because lots of people get tattooed during the war, after the war, there's a few things happen. And if any of you have heard this real idea that tattooing was only for criminals and sailors and stuff, a real large part of where it comes from in the modern period is from this post-war era. And there's a few reasons why in the 1950s tattooing is taboo. One is that simply, again, no one wants to look like their mum and dad, right? Loads of tattooed people during the war, and so tattooing's not cool anymore for the next generation. Tattooing becomes very stigmatized because of stories coming out of Auschwitz, the forced tattooing of concentration camp prisoners. It becomes a huge story about in the post-war discussion about the horrors of Nazism. And so tattooing is associated with that. And also, of course, like fashions are changing. So the 1950s and 60s are periods of sleek design, right? Monochrome, of like atomic age, like all this fussy, chintzy stuff from the, that resembles almost the Art Nouveau period is just not trendy. And the last thing, of course, is that people now say, oh, wait, no one was tattooed in my day. I never saw anyone with tattoos in the 1960s. Why do you think that was? It's because no one had their sleeves rolled up. No one wore shorts to work. The people whose bodies you saw in the 1950s were people who were working, who rolled their sleeves up, digging the roads and stuff. If your bank manager or your king had a tattoo, you'd never see it. Women didn't show their legs off. Certainly older women didn't. So huge amounts of work that was done on very rich people was never seen outside of their own intimate social circles, which creates this idea that only certain types of people have tattoos. So the 1950s, I call it the tattooing's winter. This is Cash Cooper tattooing in London in a little tiny booth. It actually is a former like gas cupboard in Piccadilly, very small. But one of the things that happens is that these guys fucking love tattooing, and even though everyone else hates it, they want it to be better. And one of the things they become really inspired by is the story of this stuff, which is the Edo Choikai, the hard-skin tattoo club of Tokyo. And after the war, stories of these gatherings of beautifully tattooed people in Tokyo were published in Life magazine and in various magazines in the English-speaking world. And these guys were like, fuck yeah, we want to do something similar, right? The way to keep tattooing alive is to start a club like the Tokyo Tattoo Club in England. Ideas about tattoo clubs had been floated as early as the 1930s. There's an amazing discussion in a magazine for the traveling show industry where lots of famous tattooers of the period write in and say, we should start a club, we should have prizes. Essentially, they invent Ink Master in the 1930s. They're like, we should have categories like best back piece, best black and gray. Never actually happens, but the next generation, this younger generation in the 50s are like, yeah, we're going to do that. So they start the tattoo club in Bristol, the Bristol Tattoo Club in 1954. This guy, Les Goose, directly inspired by those photographs from Japan, is like, we're going to do something similar here. And it's a club not just for tattoo artists, but for collectors as well. They start off, there's only, by Les's reckoning, 8 good tattooers in England in 1954. And he wants there to be more. And in fact, a lot of the romanticization of the undergroundness of tattooing and people saying, I want to go back to the underground days. The reason tattooing is not underground is because people like this wanted it to be massive because that was the way they would make money, right? So everything that happens in the second half of the 20th century is people desperately wanting to keep tattooing alive. And they do that by making it visible. They invite the press, they invite the film cameras, they get publicity, they get published all over the world. And the photos of the Bristol Tattoo Club inspire people everywhere, including in America. Those inspirations create networks, which then lead on to the snowball that create everything that follows. So I'm really kind of like wrapping through. We've got an hour and a half, so let's keep going. Everyone in the Bristol Tattoo Club had this bat tattooed on them, by the way, so that was the club logo, the Bristol Tattoo Club. Right. So Les had 2 friends in London, one of which was Cash Cooper. There he is again, that same guy. He grew a beard because he was once asked, there was once a meeting of tattooers and they said they'd have a prize for the funniest tattoo. So he just grabbed his machine and just went boop, and tattooed a moustache on himself. And he said, what do I win? What's the prize? Thinking it would be like money or, They were like, oh, it's just a box of chocolates and some flowers. And he was like, fuck. So he grew a beard after that. But Cash and this guy, Rich Mingins, Cash was very brash and loud, a real showman. Like he had a pet panther for a while and a pet hawk. Mingins was much quieter, not really publicity seeking, but an incredible kind of collector of photography. These 2 guys started an offshoot of the Bristol Tattoo Club in London, called, of course, the London Tattoo Club. And again, in 1955, they had a tattoo meetup in a pub in Clerkenwell. So basically 50 years ago, 60 years ago, next year. And the so Les Scouse came from Bristol to that meeting. A guy called Al Shafley from Sandusky, Ohio, who read about Les Scouse in the papers, came as well. And the last one of that group, that very tight-knit group of like the best tattooers in the world at the time, by their own reckoning, was a woman called Jessie Knight. I think I could do a whole talk about her, but she is this incredible woman who began tattooing when she was 17 years old in 1923 at her dad's shop in Barry in Wales. He was a crazy, crazy guy who was like quit a kind of life as a banker to become a cowboy and a like sharpshooter and did circus acts and all kinds of stuff. But he'd quite often like disappear off and he'd be like, hey, Jessie, like run the shop for me. The other thing that also got Jessie into running the shop is that her sister, Ella, got involved in the family sharpshooting act and her dad accidentally shot her sister in the head. She survived. He was shooting on a William Tell act on shoot an apple off her head and it grazed the front of her forehead. And she fucking got up and finished the show, right? But Jessie was like, fuck that, I'm the sensible one, I'm going to run a tattoo shop, right? So she ran her dad's shop for a bit in Barry, then she got married, that didn't work out. She actually traded a tattoo with a member of the Royal Guards for a gun, and because she was a trained sharpshooter, shot her husband in the fucking leg, knowing she wouldn't kill him. And was then tattooing in Kent, in Chatham, in a naval port there, and then in Aldershot and in Portsmouth. And all of her, from her whole career, all of her advertising flyers always say what pubs her shop's near, which I love, right?
Which year is this pub?
So this is a bit later. This is probably from the 90s. So she began tattooing in the 1920s. Her career really kicks off in the late 40s, early 50s. She retired in 1970. So I think this is probably like mid 50s, maybe like late 50s. Again, I could do a whole talk about her. What's happening here? Stop. I was very fortunate to convince the British government to save her stuff. So all of her collection is now owned by the British government. It's at the National Museum of Wales. And she's amazing. She's not the best like draftswoman. Her drawings aren't the best, but the way she draws women in particular is fucking incredible. Compared to pin-ups drawn by men at the time, like there's fucking energy and power in the way she draws women's faces, amongst other things. She's also hilarious. Her grandmother was a greetings card poet. So all of her shop signs are in rhyming verse. And there she is down the bottom there in the middle. There she is there with Les Scouse, another tattooer called Len Wolfe, with Rich Mingins, with Cash Cooper in 1955. So I'm really cracking on here. Maybe we'll get finished with this chapter. The other important person who's at that meeting is a young man from Switzerland called Rudi Inhelder. And he'd read in the newspaper about this book that I mentioned at the beginning, Pierced Hearts and True Love, that was published in 1954. And he wrote to the author and said, how do I find out more about tattooing? That sounds great. He's like just growing up in literally the middle of fucking nowhere in rural Switzerland, right on the Liechtenstein border. And Evanston, who he writes to, says, you need to go to London, because that's where I got my information. Evanston had worked closely with Rich Mingins in putting that book together. And so Inhelder wrote to Mingins, and Mingins said, come to London. We're having a meet up in this pub in May 55. And so Rudi Inhelder is there at that moment with all those amazing tattooers at the time. And he's instantly like, fucking, this is brilliant. And he's also a gay man. And he's like, this is also superb. I love it. He creates a great friendship with Rich Mingins. He learns from Mingins about tattoo photography collecting and becomes a real collector of historic tattoo photography. And then a few years later, in the late 50s, early 60s, gets a job in New York. He's an optical physicist, and this is the Cold War. And you can imagine like being a gay man in New York in the 50s is impossible because it's illegal to be gay. In fact, if you work in the defense industry like he did, you can be imprisoned because there's a risk and certainly lose your job because there's a thought that if it comes out you're gay, you can be blackmailed by the Russians. So he was impossible for him to be openly gay. And in the early 1960s, tattooing had been banned in New York in 1961 due to hepatitis outbreak. And so he's in New York as a gay man who loves tattooing, and both of the things he loves are illegal. So he's like, how can I meet people? How can I meet the kind of guys that I want to hang out with, the kind of people I want to hang out with? I know what. I'm a member of the Bristol Tattoo Club. I'm going to start my own club, inspired by the BTC. And he starts what is called the Tattoo Club of America. And the Tattoo Club of America is, like the Bristol Tattoo Club, a club for artists and for collectors. And he basically creates a network that becomes the modern tattoo industry, because he's, in a coded way, trying to find people like himself, but he's also just making network. He's also traveling to the best tattooers that he can find in America. He gets tattooed by Philadelphia Eddie in Camden, New Jersey. He gets tattooed by Phil Sparrow. He gets tattooed by Huck Spalding and various other people. And he creates this network which, yes, allows him to meet other gay men who are interested in tattooing, but he also allows tattooers and tattoo fans from the US, but also his friends back in England and their friends in Australia and Germany, including Tattoo Sammy, to correspond. And yes, some of the members of the club include George Bone here, who's still tattooing today, Len Wolfe, another one of these London tattooers, this guy Dick Hyland, the human autograph, who was a performing tattooed man from the Bowery. And, tattooers like Phil Sparrow and Sailor Jerry. And it's basically through the Tattoo Club of America that Sailor Jerry is introduced to Phil Sparrow, this amazing man who tattooed in Milwaukee and Chicago and in California, who had been a literature professor. He'd been a teacher of literature at DePaul University in Chicago, basically got fed up with stupid students and also was getting too old to pick up hot sailor boys that he liked. So he was like, how can I pick up the hot sailors I like? I'm going to start a tattoo shop. The story he tells is that he was hosting an orgy at his house, and he couldn't get laid at an orgy that he was hosting. So he was like, this needs to be fixed. I'm going to find myself some hot tattooed sailor boys. So he learns to tattoo by a correspondence course and becomes a tattooer. But of course, he's an academic. So he's got books about Japan. He's got books about tattoo. He's able to find information about tattoo history. And this young guy walks into his shop one day who's heard that he's this really interesting tattooer. That young man is called Ed Hardy in 1966 or so. And Hardy's covered in tattoos by Burt Grimm and others from the Pike in California. But Sparrow goes like, you need to get into the real good shit, like the Japanese stuff, and gives him some books about Japanese tattooing. And Hardy's like, what the fuck? This is fucking amazing. How do I learn more about this? And he's like, well, you can go to Japan, but the people that I know who know people in Japan, there's this guy in the Tattoo Club of America called Sailor Jerry in Hawaii. You need to go there. So it's because of Sammy, a bit of Rudy's club, that Sammy Stewart, Phil Sparrow, introduces Ed Hardy to Sailor Jerry. And the two men couldn't be more different. Sailor Jerry and Phil Sparrow, very different tattooers, but both love it in deep and profound ways. And it's that moment, I think, that in a way that becomes very obvious later on, creates the modern tattoo industry. And Jerry's very interested in Japanese art. He's massively racist against Japanese people at the same time, which is hard to make sense of. But he has a correspondent, this guy called, he's a mysterious man who's called Mr. Kita or Kida, about whom very little is known in Japan. But he seems to be Sailor Jerry's main connection initially. And it's him who introduces Jerry and therefore Ed to a guy called Kazuo Aguri, Horihide Gifu, who becomes the most sort of influential Japanese tattooer in Hardy's life and therefore on all the rest of us afterwards. So Sailor Jerry is doing this really interesting, large-scale Japanese work, but with his traditional Western style in the 1960s and 70s. 60s really dies in 72. This is Phil Sparrow with his hot sailor boys and their cute bums. And yeah, that network is the basically root of everything that happens afterwards, because it connects everyone who's interested in tattooing in the world. Right, the best artists, the most committed fans. Les Goose is doing art shows in London at this time, And this is kind of really where the modern industry is happening. And I'll finish with this chapter because this is sort of really where everything happens and we end up with the real schism. 1977, there is a the second International Tattoo Convention happened in Reno, Nevada. And there'd been a convention beforehand in 1976 in Houston, a sort of trial run to some degree. But it was a success, and so the following year, they were like, tattooers in England, tattooers in America, were like, we're going to have a big-ass convention in Reno, Nevada, 1977. And it's also a time when tattooing had been made illegal for under 18s in England in 1969. Tattooing was banned in New York in 1961. Other states in America were starting to kind of think about banning and restricting tattooing. So these guys were like, we need to be serious. We need to show the world we are serious artists, serious professionals. We need to self-regulate. So tattoo conventions, rather than being this kind of underground way for tattooers to hang out, was actually a way for tattooers to tell the world that they weren't weird. Customers like Leams and others of Hardy's like blew everyone's fucking minds because everyone was like, oh my God, who's this Ed Hardy guy? Spider Webb here and Lyle Tuttle were really pushing work. And of course, like, at the time, you know, like there was a real stigma. Some of the things that these tattooers were trying to resist was like, there was a case in the UK of someone tattooing kids. This is a guy from the 50s who's tattooed, you know, Arthur Shuttleworth. Or you have, like this guy's amazing, it's called Sinbad. He's a Sikh tattooer, Indian guy who's tattooing in Middlesbrough. Amazing tattooer, but you know, here's his notice, like you have to be over 18 to get a tattoo. But he wasn't very good as an artist. He also couldn't spell very well. He like wrote like he spoke. He had a very thick Indian accent. So when he tattooed the word father on someone, it came out as fudder. So he tattooed farter on people. Yeah, and people talked about his Sinbad specials. He's very fondly remembered, but he wasn't the greatest of artists, even though he's one of the first tattooers of colour in England. Anyway, Houston, this is one of Manfred's photos from the Houston convention. Also include, pardon? Exactly, yeah, one of your photos, yeah, exactly. Of people of colour, not hugely represented in the industry at the time, but there are prominent people. This is Valeria Wooten, who's an artist, fine artist, who was like crowned like the best tattooed woman at that first convention in '76. But you know, the real schism happened in '77 because, as I said, the whole impetus was for tattooing to show the world it was serious. Right, and it's where Ed Hardy first met Jack Rudy and Charlie Cartwright. First was excited by black and grey tattooing. Like these Tattoo Sammy from Germany was there. All these incredible artists from all over the world were like, this is fucking tattooing. This is happening now. We're a fucking thing. And at the end of the day, there was a performance by Fakir Mushafar, who I showed you at the beginning, who in the 1960s had this black work piece done and had been experimenting for his whole life in what he called primitive practices. And he was asked to do a kind of gala performance at the end of the convention. And he did a kind of fakir show. He laid on a bed of nails and he was with a belly dancer. And this is Sailor Sid, his friend. And it was also, you know, piercers were there. The modern piercing industry was starting to come out of the shadows. And this was like basically the thing that got all the headlines in the newspaper, which pissed all the tattooers off and pissed Ed Hardy off in particular. Because he was like, this is not the shit that we want, guys. Like, this is not, we don't want to be a freak show. And so there was a huge, huge schism, huge, like in the magazines, huge arguments for at least a year about whether like fucking weirdos like this guy and his pierced fucking friends could come to any of our events anymore. And they basically banned tattooing, banned piercing from being done at tattoo conventions because they thought it made them look bad. And Tattoo Sammy, Manfred's mentor, was one of the few people like saying, hey, you motherfuckers, like, no, we need to keep tattooing weird. He was writing letters saying, because he was also friends with lots of the piercers and saying like, this is not the way forward, right? But for about a decade, from the mid 70s to like even to the late 80s, Fakir and Ed Hardy, although they live really close to each other in California, are doing very different things. Ed Hardy's talking about tattooing as art. Fakir's talking about tattooing as spiritual practice. They're learning from each other, but they're very, very separate practices. And this is Jack Rudy's work from the 70s as well. Like black and grey is a thing that happens for the first time, blows everyone away. Here's Jackie Gresham, one of Rudy and Helder's friends, a black guy. Very tattooing's still very white and very male at this time, but there are these amazing exceptions. And so what happens, and this is where I'll finish, is that these two divergent worlds kind of grow on their own. Ed Hardy eschewing the kind of primitive idea, Fakir really embracing it. Ed Hardy does an exhibition in 1977 in Oakland with photography, working these incredible hybrid styles that combine like new fine line stuff with American traditional, with this kind of black work and Japanese, like this real amazing syncretic hybrid styles happening in the late 70s, which is really where modern tattooing happens for the first time. Oh, here's Ryochi. This is one of my favourite tattoos of all time. It's at the back of the room here. This is Ryochi's arm by Leo Zulueta, one of Ed's close confidants, who's really like inventing modern tribal through the 90s and early 2000s, with Cliff Raven as well. But what happens is, at the end of the 80s, this book Modern Primitives is published, and it brings Ed and Fakir back together again under the same umbrella. Right, where neither of them properly fit. So Ed comes to England for the first time in 1979, invited by a guy called Ron Ackers, and everyone in England's like, fucking hell, have you seen this Ed Hardy guy? A guy called Dennis Cockle, in whose shop Ed's work, if you compare his work pre-Ed Hardy, which is very nice but very traditional American pinup, to post-Ed Hardy, fucking acid-toned dragons. You can see the influence that Ed has on everybody. And yeah, like when I was, as I said, this is where I'll finish, I was trying to make sense of the world of tattooing and how much stuff was happening. And Paul found these in the archives in Oakland, and what they are is what's called the family tree of California tattooing. And it's basically a way that Ed tried to explain to the curators of that exhibition what the fuck was happening. And Ed very helpfully, Ed here, did a beautiful family tree of everyone that influenced him and everyone that came before him. And like this goes through Johnny Hardy here, and we've got Horihide and Kazuo Oguri, this man in Japan. We've got Jack Rudy, this man whose work he's just seen for the first time and blows him away. You've got Phil Sparrow here and Sailor Jerry. Milton Zeiss, who wrote How to Tattoo instructions, from which Phil Sparrow learned. You have Lyle Tuttle down here. You have Davy Jones, this figure who we talked about right at the beginning, all the way back through Burt Grimm and Pop Eddie, and all the way back to the late 19th century. And this is essentially how I ended up structuring the second half of the book. It's basically trying to figure out, like, actually everything goes through Ed Hardy ultimately. And this is my anecdote. When Ed did there was a retrospective career exhibition in San Francisco of Ed's work, and I got a phone call from the journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle, and they were like, "Can you give us a quote, that we can use in the article?" And I was like, "Yeah, look, this is Ed Hardy's, Ed Hardy made the modern toe industry." My friend Tom, with whom I do a podcast, says, it's Ed Hardy's world and we just live in it. And they put that, because it was an article about Ed, and I got an email the week after that was like, "Hello, I'm Sailor Jerry's nephew. Have you heard of Sailor Jerry?" And I was like, "Motherfucker, you've only heard of Sailor Jerry because Ed Hardy told you about him." Right? So God bless all of the people that came before, but it is through pretty much exclusively through Ed that everything that happens afterwards happens. Through his publications, through his advocacy, through his experimentation, even things that he didn't even like, he championed. And this is why it gets difficult in the 2000s to talk about tattooing in a more constrained way, because before Ed Hardy, Jack Rudy described it this way. He said, before Ed Hardy, there was two types of tattooing: take it or leave it. Right? And after Ed Hardy, all of a sudden you had black and grey, you had Japanese, you had new school, you had traditional, you had experimental, conceptual. And all of that stuff is championed in the late 70s, early 80s, up until the mid 90s. And after that, everything explodes. When Modern Primitives is published in 1989, the whole world is turned on to what's been happening in California. the previous decade. So I will finish there. Thank you very much. Probably got about 10 minutes for questions if anyone has any, but thank you very much for listening. Cheers. Didn't even talk about Mrs. Sebastian, but yeah. Any questions? No, I told you everything you wanted to possibly know. So look, I'm around, please come and ask me questions. I'm doing this other talk more about Japan tomorrow. I have a podcast, which is called Beneath the Skin, where you can listen to discussions between me and my co-host producer Tom, interviews with people. I interviewed Margot Mifflin last week, who wrote the incredible Bodies of Subversion book about tattooed women in the late 90s. We've had Paul on. That's on Spotify and everywhere you get podcasts. And this book is out in November, just in time for Christmas. And my last book you can pick up anywhere, or you can buy a copy directly from me, not here, but contact me, and I'm happy to sell you a copy. So thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. Cheers, guys. Thanks. Oh yeah, sorry, I nearly forgot. I promised Manfred. So Manfred Kors, who took some of these photos, he's a really important part of these stories, has got 2 books with him. One about Tattoo Sammy, who's this incredible German artist who was this advocate. His Flash book, he's got copies with him to sell. And also he's also got this incredible book of early 20th century British Flash, which I think, my hypothesis is it might be by the same guy whose work we had here, Joe Hartley. Incredible Flash book of the 19th century. He's also got a copy. He's here. Come find him, give him your money, because his work's amazing. And he's been so helpful with this project, as has Paul King, who is over there, whose photos you've seen. And I couldn't do this work without amazing collectors and historians from inside the industry like these guys. So thank you, Manfred. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ryochi. Thank you, Naho. Yeah, cheers.